Hello, everyone, and welcome to Just Thinking, starring Mary Greendale. I'm John Drohan. I'll be sitting in for Mary tonight as she is not available for tonight's program. Tonight, we're talking about a debate. We're having a debate between two people over a very important issue here in town government. The two people that are joining me tonight are Ben Sparrell, who is a member of the Select Board, and Dan Alfred, a member of the Finance Committee. Tonight's debate is a proposed bylaw change recommended by the town-approved Holliston Governance Committee, and specifically, this is the proposal. Number one, to place the responsibility of the town budget planning and development with the town administrator and town financial team that are all full-time positions. Number two, to have the Finance Committee's responsibility to provide an independent review of the financial warrant, articles, and recommendations to the town meeting and remain its primary role as the objective advisor to town meeting. The Finance Committee would begin its review of the comprehensive budget after the budget was transmitted to the town administrator. And number three, the town administrator would consult with the Finance Committee throughout the budget planning and development process. So what does this all mean? Essentially what we're saying here is that we would like to, the debate is going to be on the town budget, on the budget and how and who is going to be responsible for this. The two gentlemen that are with me tonight have a disagreement on this, but before we get into that, I want to give a little bit of history of the town administrator. So in 1994 town meeting, that was where the vote was created to create the town administrator position and give that position responsibility for activities that had been done by elected members of the select board. So that was when the town administrator was born. The Government Study Committee, under the direction of Sam Tyler, presented to the results to that town meeting. Last year, Sam Tyler approached the Select Board to recommend that another government study initiative begin. Just as that was getting underway, the search firm that was helping Holliston look for a town administrator warned the Select Board that the professional administrators need and want of clear budget policies in writing to ensure clear lines of authority and responsibility. So the town administrator, these positions needed to have clear guidance on what the budget responsibilities were. So this is the bylaw change that is potentially being proposed at this town meeting, and these two gentlemen are going to discuss what their opinions are. So without further ado, I'll initiate tonight's debate. And remember, we discussed this before the debate began. These guys they've worked together before, so they are acrimonious, and they plan to have a nice, fun, spirited debate to present their opinions. But there won't be any animosity or bad blood. That never happens on Holliston Cable Access TV anyway, especially on Just Thinking. Mary Greendale wouldn't allow that. Okay. So my initial question, and this is for both of you, and we'll start with Dan. What do you believe is the intent of the proposed bylaw changes? And then to follow on with that, what are some of the advantages and disadvantages of these bylaw changes?
Great. And so I wanted to start, John, by thanking you for availing yourself of the time to, on a relatively short notice, to take over for Mary. And thank Mr. Sparrell for suggesting that we get together and do this. Well, what I think that you stated and your sort of overview is absolutely true. I think that a lot of my issues with the recommendation are nuanced, and so ultimately the main issue that I have is that what the governance committee is recommending is that control of the budget that gets presented to town meeting would shift from being the finance committee's recommendation to the select board's recommendation, and I think that this sort of adds a lot of different complications, and you now would have a board with significant spending interest, 30 to 40% of the town budget, and I'm going to say bias, but I mean bias is in they have their own agendas and desires and goals for the town, directly competing with other departments in towns, especially the schools. I mean, largely the schools, right, at 55% of the budget. But then they also are now controlling the budget that is ultimately recommended to town meeting. So that to me just drives a significant conflict of interest and takes away from that independent oversight and sort of where the finance committee treats everyone equal, hears all of the requests, and does what we can with the money that the town has, which is frankly, always too little than the recommendations. But you did talk about the TA Special Act, and I think that's also very important, because one of the things that the recommendation doesn't do is it can't alter the TA Special Act. And the TA Special, because that's a state law and we would need to seek additional special legislation. And so with the TA Special Act says that, well, we want to empower our financial, our financial, I don't want to say, professionals is a weird word because, I mean, obviously they are professionals, but I also think that Mr. Sparrell's a professional, you're a professional, we're all professionals, well, some of us are volunteers. We all work hard for the town. But it empowers the town employees to do more. And I actually agree that they absolutely should be doing more. But the town administrator is sort of handcuffed, if you will, because the TA Special Act, under Section 6B, states that the town administrator shall be responsible for the implementation of all policies, directives, and votes of the Board of Selectmen, now the Select Board. So the town administrator isn't an independent body. If a Select Board chose, they could dictate the terms of what this independent person said. So the problem is that you shift from a biased board making the recommendation to town meeting and away from sort of the oversight board, ways and means, if you will, of sort of town meeting in the finance committee to the select board. And then also you're giving more authority to a position that is not truly able to act independently outside of the select board. So there's additional conflicts, and I think that as you go forward in a budget process, that's going to become quite difficult for independent boards to navigate. And so that to me gets into sort of some of the weeds, and I'll let sort of Ben give some of his thoughts. I mean, I certainly have more, but.
Okay, great, thank you. Ben.
To reiterate what Mr. Alfred said, thank you to both of you. Mr. Drohan, I really appreciate you coming here. I also appreciate HCAT coming. And Dan, thanks for agreeing to have this conversation on camera.
Always up for a spirit.
I think, there are certainly areas that we do agree. I mean, I do think that the special acts in 1994, there's some changes that need to be made to those particular special acts, and I think we need to update them and freshen them for the current age. They were written in a different period, and we need to make some changes. And I know one of the things the governance committee plans to do is to examine those acts. So I think that's coming down the pipeline. It's just not necessarily at this time. To take a step back, from my perspective, before I get into anything that you had particularly brought up, the things that I want to mention about what the governance committee did that I notice is that they were working to look at best practices in other towns. And now, certainly, we're not every other town, and what works in one town may not work in Holliston, but it's a good place to start. See what other people are doing, and to contextualize a budget process and to adapt those best practices that other towns are utilizing to Holliston. Holliston has its own unique needs and prejudices and methods of doing things that need to be accounted for as we do these kinds of things. But I think what they were trying to accomplish, in my opinion, is to create a process with clear roles and responsibilities, to make it clear to the average person, to the people on the boards, and to the town administrator what their roles and responsibilities are, and to try to put some transparency and some longevity to these particular results, because some of the other things that have been happening with policies and things like that they can be changed, they can be altered, and having this go through a bylaw process I think is particularly important, because then we have resident input, and town meeting can do those kinds of things in a public way. And I think that's very important that we do these things. And one of the other things I think that is important is to create dates certain and deliverables, and to make it clear who needs to deliver what and when. And I think that's part of what I see to be very important, to set expectations of the individual actors within the budget process. And one of the things that you brought up, Dan, is that the control of the budget would be under the select board's recommendation. And one of the things that, to bring up the special acts, because they are still a law, is that if you look in 6D, it says that it's the town administrator's recommendations, not necessarily the select board's. And I understand that the town administrator works for the select board, but in many respects, the role of the select board is to oversee what the town administrator is doing, not necessarily to say, do this, do this, do this. And at the end of the day, town meeting is actually the final arbiter in these cases and says, this is what's supposed to happen, this is how this is supposed to work. So, you know, we all have someone that is making sure that we're doing our jobs, those checks and balances. You know, we work with electors, we work with other boards, and the role of the Finance Committee is critical and vital to the town. And it's trying to outline what the town administrator's role is, what the select board's role is, and what the Finance Committee's role is in this budget process. I think it's critical, and I think it's very important that we have that.
Mm-hmm. If I could respond.
One sec.
Sure.
You had, hold that thought. I had said that I would probably only ask one question, but you've already touched on question number 3. And I just want to make this point before you respond to this. So just to be clear, we are under the town meeting system. So as you know, for Joe average citizen, that the town meeting essentially is going to decide at the end of the day, the town meeting makes the decision that they vote on the budget, they decide whether, you know, and so all of the input that comes from the various boards or from the town administrator eventually goes to town meeting. I just wanted to make sure that everybody's kind of clear on that, and that was the points you brought up. But please go ahead and respond.
No, absolutely, that's right. I mean, all of what we're talking about here is just who makes the recommendations and sort of the decisions that then go to town meeting.
And I think that's an important
for the final
point.
authorization.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Absolutely.
Nothing that we're doing. I mean, the select board does have authority under certain circumstances for certain things to make decisions without town meeting, but those are very limited and by state law. But
Right.
other than
The
that,
appropriating authority in Holliston is town meeting.
is town meeting. Absolutely, and so I would just say that if it doesn't sound like we're sort of saying that, just understand, we understand that, and sometimes we talk, and some of the issues that we've had may be around just sort of, as we talk about things, just because it's easier not to qualify everything, right? Let's say the Finance Committee recommendation to town meeting, which is the ultimate authority, you know, we just say what we're recommending,
right.
So that,
Sure.
So when I do want to get back. So when we started this whole process, and I heard about the governance committee thing, I said, you know, why do we need a bylaw? You know, we have policies, they work. One thing that I have changed my mind on as we've gone through this entire process is I do now actually believe that we do need a bylaw. Now I disagree with what the content of the bylaw is, but I do see the benefits to having a bylaw.
Okay.
And to clearly delineating what everybody's role in the process is. I still think it is critically important to Holliston's to Holliston's success in the future, financially and otherwise, that the recommendation to town meeting come from the Finance Committee. But just to touch on the best practices, because again, I do believe that the Governance Committee did a lot of work. They certainly looked at other towns, and you know, I think that looking at other towns is certainly a good way to do it. But what I've asked them, and I've yet to actually hear back from them, what were the results from those towns? You know, they showed ratings and everything, and the ratings were comparable to ours. You know, are they better able to fund different projects? I mean, you know, there's been no sort of quantitative analysis of whether the systems that these other towns have have actually resulted in better outcomes than ours. So for me, I mean, it's interesting to look, but I don't think you can say that that's best practices unless you can actually say that the results are quantifiably better. So you know, I mean, I think you obviously want to always be looking at other ways of doing things and seeing if you can adopt them. But Holliston has a very sort of, I don't know, it's not unique, I think other towns do it, but we have a very sort of Holliston way of going about things that has actually stood us in really good stead. And I would hate to just blow that up just because other towns are doing other things. In fact, looking through the Governance Committee's report and their comparable towns, one of the things that I've actually noticed is the most consistent thing about the way that different towns do form of town government is the fact that it's completely inconsistent. There's no sort of like state, you know, suggested, you know, sort of order to how everything is done. I mean, there's certain things, there's the Finance Committee handbook, and there's different things, but every town has a different way of doing it. They may have, some towns may have a, you know, the Finance Committee recommending to town meeting, but then the Select Board doing, I mean, you know, it's all very different. So I think that that's very important for people to understand is it's more what works for the town. The state has actually allowed there to be great latitude in what it is. And in fact, actually, it's my understanding, and they can correct, I believe it came from the Governance Committee, that all the towns they looked at were also charter towns. So they had all adopted charters, which Holliston has not yet. So, and then I wanted to also just touch upon your point about 6D, Because you're right, the 6D does specifically give the town administrator responsibility. But what it says is the town administrator shall be responsible for the preparation of the annual operating budget for all town departments and agencies under the jurisdiction of the Board of Selectmen, or now Select Board. So it does give him that, but not for the all-encompassing budget. What it does is it says that he shall compile, which means receive, put into a spreadsheet, prepare. And I think that that's very important. Some people seem to misconstrue compile to be some sort of active a verb, but to me, compile is purely a ministerial responsibility, right? I mean, if you go out and you say, can you just compile this list of attendees? That's not creating the list, who's invited to something. That's not going out, sending out invitations and being part of it. No, you're just saying, hey, these are the invitations we've gotten in. We're just going to compile that list. So, I firmly believe that the town administrator should be involved in pretty much every part and consulted and included. And in fact, I think some of the things that could be changed is the fact that, we have all these independent boards, and I absolutely want to keep them the same and keep their independence and their ability to budget. But one of the things we've had this year is a number of requests from these independent boards for additional personnel. Well, the town administrator is the chief personnel officer. So you've got independent boards requesting, new positions or increases in positions. But then that's then reporting, those people will report either to a manager who reports to the town administrator or to directly to the town administrator. And I think that what we've done on the finance committee this year, which has been great because, again, Travis is great. Though, again, I want to be very clear, some of the things that the governance committee say are we're doing this now because we have this great town administrator. That's absolutely true. We do have a great town administrator now. But we shouldn't be making law based upon who's in the seat currently. So, but one of the things we've been doing is we've turned to Travis and said, hey, so you're the chief personnel officer. This is all very expensive, lots of different requests. Some people just, increasing hours a little bit, making them benefits eligible. Is there a way that you can make things more efficient across different departments in town? That some that you oversee, others that you don't. And I would like to see something where, not that they take away the responsibility from the independent board, but something, I don't know what the wording would be, but something like the town administrator should be consulted on any changes to personnel requests, even by independent boards, and that while the authority remains with the independent board to make the request to the finance committee for recommendation to town meeting, that at least then the town administrator would be involved in that and can make his own recommendation to us on how he sees it working.
So this is a good example. This is an example, kind of from your opinion, of kind of where, if I understand, this is kind of how. Yep, the finance committee still needs to kind of be the overall, the overall recommender, like the final recommender on, and for the example of if we want to increase, personnel and affect the budget in that way. Is that what you're saying?
Well, keep in mind, the finance committee doesn't take up any action that hasn't been voted and approved and been requested by a authorized, executive board. So we would never go to a department and say, hey, we think you're a little light there on staffing. You should hire new staffing.
You're a reactionary force.
We're reactionary. And I think there has been a misconception that we're out there building, but building department budgets. Couldn't be further from the truth. I understand when the prior town administrator was here, he was a little bit more hands-off on budgets, but we were still not building those budgets. We do have liaison meetings. We discuss if there are questions from those boards or departments, we certainly will give them feedback. But we're not building that budget. We shouldn't be building those budgets. That's not our role.
So, Ben, my question to you is, my specific question is, so Dan brought up, all right, so this is where these are the issues that I'm having. Why would we have to change something? Why do we have, if it's not broke, why do we have to fix it? So specifically, why do you think, what do you think the benefit is going to be if the bylaw changes are made?
Well,
why
first,
is it better?
Okay, well, so a couple things. First of all, clarity and clear understanding for a resident and for the members of boards who is responsible and who they're supposed to present to and what they're supposed to present. And it will also create a system that has longevity, because at the end of the day, we want to make sure that putting too much responsibility in the hands of particularly elected officials can be a little bit risky in some senses, because those elected officials turn over, and you have varying degrees of capacity. And I mean, I can give you a specific example from my own experience on the Finance Committee. Is I took on some capital improvement responsibilities in compiling some data and maintaining a spreadsheet and it was a role that I didn't feel comfortable doing, but I knew that this needed to be done. And as an the town administrator should be doing that. And those kinds of things, that put me in a position that I felt very uncomfortable with, but it also needed to be accomplished and needed to be finished. But I think, one of the things that, as I was preparing for this, one of the things I'm struggling with as I contemplate this is that if you look at the Mass General Laws, it's Chapter 39, Section 16. That's the section that talks about finance committees. There's a line in there that says that in the absence of a bylaw that the Board of Selectmen, as it refers to it, would present the budget to town meeting. In the absence of a bylaw to have that, the Finance Committee would present the budget. So, ergo, I understand we don't have a bylaw that says that, therefore the Finance Committee would present the budget. And I completely agree with that. The problem I have here is that, in my opinion, we are conflating the recommendation of the Finance Committee with presenting the budget to town meeting. So what can happen in that sort of a circumstance is if a board, let's say the Select Board, approves a budget, and then the Finance Committee makes a different recommendation that is not the same, that is not the approved budget of the Select Board, to town meeting and says this is the budget. That budget has only been approved at the end of the day by the Finance Committee, and it has not been approved by the authority that is spending the money.
Well, sorry not to interrupt, but I mean that's where town meeting can come in, and the select board raises their hand and say, well, no, this is really what we want, and then you have that debate at town meeting, right?
Yes.
And and ideally you don't actually have that, right? Ideally we all have sort of a powwow and we understand each other beforehand. So we agree though we need more structure. Totally agree we need more structure. But I think that where I believe that the Finance Committee recommendation is powerful is that because the Select Board inherently has a bias because they have their own desires to spend money, and then you've got the schools that have a desire to spend the money, and the library, the Parks and Rec, all the independent boards. If you don't have an independent sort of party that does not have any sort of preconceived notions or really or spending goals, right? I mean, I could easily see, and granted, no one wants to talk hypotheticals, but if we had a huge deficit at the bottom line after all requests are in, right? How does that get divvied up? Because if the Select Board knows that it's their budget that gets proposed to town meeting, and that if it's such a large number, it probably would be very difficult to unravel, right? Where do people feel comfortable knowing that there's an independent party who's saying, okay, we see that, we like that, but let's talk here and give. Where's the leverage to have the Select Board come down on their request, have the schools come down on their request? I mean, ultimately, that's having somebody who has no skin in the game as far as desires to spend money, and then also the Finance Committee is there to ensure that we try to balance. And I know that this has been a conflict, but we balance short-term spending goals, right? And long-term, not just savings, but long-term, positioning to be able to plan for big projects, and hopefully not be able to fund them through, within the budget and within the levy, and not actually have to raise taxes on taxpayers. And that's something where the Select Board's, elected to do things, right? To get things done, to spend money, to try to show people that they're making improvements in their daily lives. That would be my argument. And the school committee is the same way, right? And then they have a whole bunch of other issues that complicate their budget. The Finance Committee really can be that in between. And don't get me wrong, everything can then be motioned to amend on the floor of town meeting.
So, but if my question is, if the Finance Committee is going to be the in-between, and as the bylaw is understood, and you could probably help me on this, so and you as well. So as the bylaw is understood, if the final presentation, I guess is what it is, it comes to the town administrator. Why is it your concern? Your concern is that the Select Board is that it won't be an unbiased that the select board will have too much influence over that town administrator's presentation?
Well, I mean, the town administrator puts together the budget, but she, and the select board don't review the independent board's requests. They see them, and that's why it's important. And don't get me wrong, the select board needs to be involved more than I think maybe in the past that they have, as far as, and Travis is doing this and just sort of where things are looking and everything. And I think that the prior town administrator wasn't great at that. I think Paul, previously was better with that. But also there's a misconception that a lot changed when Paul left and the new town administrator came on. I think the largest change was simply that Ken, the chair of the finance committee, instead of going to the town administrator for stuff, would actually have to go to the accountant and the treasurer. And that it wasn't like we were trying to build budgets. But anyway.
But you brought up a great point. If I just
Yeah.
interrupt, you brought up a great point about that we can't make the policy based on the personalities, right? We can't build this on the personnel. So if we have a great town administrator right now, we can't just say, all right, now we have to change it because this person is good at what they do, right? So,
Right.
So the idea of kind of the longevity, and this is something that I'd like to hear you guys both talk about. So the idea of the consistency and the longevity of a bylaw change that is going to be able to enable the town to continue, when, you guys and everybody else kind of, has kind of moved on to their next phase of life, right?
Yeah. Well, I think we both agree that there should be a bylaw now
Yes.
to set up a budget
Yeah.
process.
But-
It's just what the content.
Yeah.
Let me just sort of touch on one thing that you brought up, and the one of the things that I think is important is, I was mentioning about like date certain when things would happen. So one of the things that I think can be a bit frustrating is the finance committee historically waits till the end of the process to make the recommendation, to take votes that can then be acted upon. So, if a department budget is going to be recommended to be different than what was initially presented to the finance committee, there was a change for some particular reason, not going with a particular initiative or a policy. Going so late creates a situation where open boards can't meet to actually sit down and say, hey, we need to make a change and we want to accept, or we want to work with the finance committee. If the finance committee engaged with that part of the process earlier, as it stands right now, the finance committee has not taken any votes on any budgets, and they've had budgets for weeks. And and I understand that there's certainly budgets, and I understand that there's a big picture that needs to be addressed.
Right.
But some of the particulars can be already taken care of in saying, hey, you know what, something like this particular thing, we have some questions. And being able to address those questions or even take them off the table and then come to some agreement earlier in the process would be incredibly beneficial, because then it would still maintain the authority for the boards to be able to present a budget, because they are the ones that do that. Because the finance committee, as you said, does not build budgets and can't build budgets.
Right. So
the
if we're saying we need
recommendation's
to
important.
cut back, instead of saying this is what we're going to cut, give you guys time to propose what
Yeah,
you would
just
like.
to be able to say, look, we would not recommend favorable action on this particular item because we feel that, there's not enough money, or there's concerns about whether or not this fits, whatever it is, because then the particular boards can go back and say, okay, we can make some changes, and they have some time to be able to do those things. With open meeting law, and with the fact that you have to put stuff out 2 days before to be able to post and things like that, it gets very difficult when you have a very short window to be able to do that. And then in some cases, it also being able to have that notification.
So let me just address sort of why sometimes things slip. But
Sure.
let me just say, that's a great point. I think we can do better with that.
Yeah.
I don't know how putting it into bylaw time, because everything is in flux, right?
Sure.
And obviously we all know that one of the reasons we haven't taken any votes right now, and we're going to sort of be forced to because the calendar is basically run out, but is that there is one large budget that changes or changes to the request anyway, not to say that's necessarily what's going to be funded, could alter everything, right? And so if it came in lower than, then we're obviously talking about the schools, but if the request ended up coming in lower, there could in theory be other monies to be freed up. Though I wanted to say that just because there's a reduction in one department's budget does not mean we've now freed up free cash or sort of a surplus, right? I don't believe that there's anything, you may call it a surplus, or people may say surplus, but
You're under the levy limit.
you're under the levy limit, but that's
last
still
night.
taxpayer dollars, right?
Yes.
If you don't spend that money, it doesn't get taxed by the taxpayer. So, I mean, that's one thing that I think sometimes gets forgotten here is that every dollar we're spending well, not every dollar because we do state aid and everything, but most of the dollars that we're spending are taxpayer dollars. And we want to be good stewards of that. But the process gets delayed, and the reason we haven't taken any votes is that, well, A, there are 2 contracts, labor contracts that are still outstanding, and that may have huge impacts to things. But I believe we're taking votes tomorrow, and yeah, I mean, it is later than anyone would like, and usually it's not this late. I think we're usually a little earlier, but I hear you about that it's hard for other boards to react, and I think we should try to work on that. Try to come up with something. I don't know if what's in the proposal as far as timeline works. I don't like the idea of fixing things concretely, because again, things are last year. Look at it. I mean, if you, in theory, everyone would probably be in violation of the bylaws just because we didn't have town meeting until July 20th. I mean, everything, March 12th.
It was a weird year.
It was a weird year, but things always come up. Not usually that big, but I do hear you on that, and I do see the issue from the executive board, how that could be problematic, and so that's something that definitely I would like to see sort of addressed. But again, I felt like we've been able to give feedback to the governance committee, but it's because they seem to be so goal oriented on this. The select board gets the sort of the control and the vote. It's been.
I disagree, because I think it's more putting it in the hands of the town administrator. I think it's important to put the budget process in the hands of the professional. I mean, as you know, we're volunteers.
Yeah.
And the finance committee is 7 volunteers with no staff. And, the fact is that the select board has some staff. And it's important they work on behalf of the town, and they are financial experts, and they have the capacity and the time to be able to do this. And it's very important to utilize the fact that somebody can do that. Like, I mean, let me give you an example. It's like I watched your March 13th meeting on the finance committee, and there were some questions about things like the revolving fund for Parks and Recreation. There were some questions about adding particular staff, and I think it was Board of Health and the town clerk. And, good questions to be asked, but having the town administrator be a layer between those proposals, some of those questions. Now, that doesn't mean there's any changes being made, but the town administrator has a role in 6D to make a recommendation and could say, here's a recommendation that could meet those goals, and to be able to help advise some of those individuals on particular options, given the breadth of knowledge of a town administrator in handling things like revolving funds and being the personnel director of the town.
What I will say is, I mean, in response to all those questions that we had about the Board of Health budget and the Parks budget, we did talk to Travis and say, Travis, can you go and figure out a plan? So we're already sort of doing that, and so we can codify that, if you will, but we're already utilizing Travis in that way. But what I will say is, and it sounds like you would be supportive then of the Finance Committee hiring a part-time staff person then?
I don't think, I think it's redundant.
I'm kidding. I'm kidding. We don't want a part-time staff, but you're right, and I want to empower the town administrator more. I mean, these are the people that are doing the work. We should have an office of finance and all of that. But until you have changed the Town Administrator Act that basically says that the select board controls whatever the town administrator does and can vote to do whatever, you don't really have the town administrator also isn't really independent. And even then, the town administrator, in this case, is not a town resident, but always a town resident. I still think that the final sort of decision and recommendation that goes to town meeting should not be the town administrators, but should be an elected board. And I think that as we've made the case, I mean, I think it should be the Finance Committee's recommendation. Again, that can then be amended by town meeting if but in general, I mean, the governance committee, I mean, pretty much everyone we've talked to says that the Finance Committee has done a great job. So the Finance Committee is doing a great job. Why change that? I mean, I think that
but your primary concern is the independence of the town administrator with respect to the budget.
Well, and then the final recommendation to town meeting being.
Well, if it comes from them, then it could be influenced in some way by the select board.
To be clear, you could you could put into bylaw and say that the town administrator's budget should be, the town administrator has complete autonomy from the select board over that,
Right.
but I still would think that it should be the finance committee. I mean, so I think that, but when you combine the fact that if you're recommending the select board budget then goes to town meeting, and the fact that the town administrator is in no way sort of independent from the select board, that's like the sort of the ultimate sort of, I don't want to say worst case, but it creates the most conflicts.
It somewhat excludes the finance committee altogether.
We would be left to basically be, writing a report and complaining about, things that we thought were done wrong. And, I don't really, we would have no real authority to try to put the financial goals and best practices
Right,
that
so
we have.
it's not an authority. It's more you're an advisor at that point, or the finance committee is an advisor to the town administrator.
They can
at that
easily be ignored, really.
theoretically, it could be right, and then your argument is that that's not necessarily the case. That
Well, yeah, my argument is I mean, I'm not a municipal finance expert, and none of us are. And the fact is that we have a municipal finance expert, a town administrator. And I think, to the point that this particular proposal does not in any way diminish the Finance Committee's role. And I think the Finance Committee has a role to play in its recommendation at town meeting, and it certainly has a role to play to make sure that boards and committees are doing their due diligence. And I know I could go through examples of when the Finance Committee forced some boards and committees to go back and redo their work because things weren't ready. Hold on, I'm getting there. Mm-hmm. And I think, again, coming back to the timing issue, is that the role of the goal here is to be able to have a process that brings all of us together mm-hmm. and works together to get to a final end product. Because what's happening right now is a very siloed system where one board is doing their thing, another board's doing their thing, and then it's sort of trying to figure it out mm-hmm. at the end. And I realize town meeting would be the final arbiter with a conflict between the select board and the finance committee. But having the finance committee engage with the select board directly in votes and saying, hey, this is what we think you should be doing, with votes and recommendations earlier in the process, creates and forces change. And to your point, yeah, it's still an advisory role, but that is exactly what the Finance Committee is doing, is acting as the financial watchdog for the community to make sure that taxpayer dollars are adequately and properly being spent, and then to advise town meeting on what should be done. And if there's a conflict, I think that it needs to be the policy-making board, because the Finance Committee can't make budgets, and budgets are policy. Budgets are a policy document to say these are the important things that are happening. And if the Finance Committee is going to get up and say that the recommendation of the Finance Committee is contrary to that other board, it's undermining the very authority of that other board. But if it was engaged earlier, it's not to say the Finance Committee's ideas or capacity or comments are invalid. They are valid, they are important. But they're not part of a process, they're the ending. And that's, I think, where it needs to be earlier. And that's where I think timing and date certain for some of these things, I think, is so critical. And having the town administrator present a budget earlier in the process gives the Finance Committee more time to engage with it and be able to make choices and say, hey, we want to negotiate about some of these things. We think that there's, too much of this, not enough of that, whatever, and to be able to have a give and take, that there would be runway to be able to make those changes in anticipation of town meeting. And then when we get to town meeting, there might be a budget, maybe one or two, but not multiple budgets that need to be addressed. And I think from my perspective, again, not to beat the dead horse, but making sure that the Finance Committee isn't making decisions on behalf of duly elected boards, I think is very important. I think it's undermining our authority.
Okay, so just to get back to the fact, this proposal absolutely does change the responsibilities of the Finance Committee, and it degrades them significantly. Because the only reason that we're able to go to a board who's making a presentation and say, hey, go do more work, this isn't going to fly, is because they know that if they don't do that, it's not going to, get a favorable recommendation to town meeting.
But that's
So-
a good, that's a good question, because that part, and again, I'm just learning this right now. So the idea of that the finance committee can go to another board and say, hey, no, you need to go back and redo this. This isn't good, or do your homework on this.
Yeah.
And you're saying that the only reason that they can do that is because of the threat that you guys won't approve their board? Is there nothing
Not
written
approve,
that-
recommend.
or is there anything written that says that the finance committee has the authority to? So there's no bylaw that says that I can go to a specific and say, no, that's not good enough. You need to redo
No,
it.
state law says that unless you say that it's the select board budget that goes to town meeting, it's the finance committee's budget that goes to town meeting, and therefore,
But I'm
you know,
talking about from the independent boards or from the school board and.
well, we
and
just
those-
would recommend a lower budget without that item in there that they were proposing if they hadn't done the work.
But I like the idea of the finance committee being the watchdog of those boards and making sure that they do their due diligence.
And look, we do, and I know that there's this sort of perception sometimes that the schools get whatever they want, and I think that's because a lot of the conversations that happen with the schools happen publicly, but happen at budget subcommittee meetings, which are open meetings, public open meetings, but they don't necessarily happen right, when the presentation is happening. But believe me, we push back on the schools, incredibly. I mean, that they are the 800-pound. I mean, their budget this year request is $37 million
Right.
of $68 million of total spending in town. And so, I hear what you're saying, but when you have limited dollars, something's got to give, right?
Sure.
And if we have to shave $100,000 from the budget to balance it, right? Because again, you have to go to town meeting with a balanced budget, right?
Correct.
And come to you and say, find it. I mean, I'm fine with that. We don't necessarily need a priority list if you don't want a priority list. For us has always been easy because, again, as you said about the open meeting law and everything, if we have your priorities, then we kind of know what we can cut because you've already told us where you want to make sure is sacred before anything else. But if you want to try to work it somewhere differently, sure, absolutely. But let's not. I mean, the finance committee is involved in policy. It's involved in the financial policy of the town, and where all decisions are made, are spending decisions. I mean, that all then sort of get back to our financial policies and ensuring that we're doing the best for the town. And just because you're meeting them in certain ways does not mean that you're sort of meeting them, in the sort of the long term. But one thing I would say, I mean, I have never, that I can recall, and you can call me on this if you want, simply voted against something because I don't like it. I've voted against things that I haven't liked, but that haven't also been fully formed, that I believe need more time. But a good example of this is so in October of 2019, and one of the reasons why this all sort of got started is because the select board at the time was upset that the finance committee had not recommended 3 studies that they wanted, and then additionally we got into a disagreement about overspending of managerial salary adjustments. But there were 3 proposed studies, one for water mains, another for sidewalks, and the third for the DPW. And at the time, the select board came to us with these 3 studies and kind of said, hey, this is what we want to do, just give us the money. Hadn't really presented a plan, why they wanted it, all the details. And we said, we don't have all the details, and not to mention, it's not just this $200,000, $300,000 for studies, there's hundreds or tens of millions of dollars of spending behind it.
Understand.
So anyway, so we voted not to recommend, and town meeting, by the way, agreed and voted not to fund those. So the ultimate decider was not the finance committee, but town meeting. Travis, the new town administrator, came in, did some more work. They came back. They said, okay, these are the 2 priorities we want. We want the water mains and the sidewalks. And while I still think that I have a lot of problems with sort of some of the ideas of the sidewalks and everything, I voted to recommend the town meeting authorize the spending on the sidewalks. I don't personally like that project. That would not be. I think that there are many other things in town that we could spend our money on before sidewalks and before, certainly the $40,000 for the sidewalk study. But again, that was made clear to us that was a priority of the select board, and so I did not put my personal let my personal opinions dictate my vote.
Okay.
And so I think that it's clear that that's not our goal. Is not to sort of. We all have preconceived notions. We all have our ideas. But if the money is there, and in that case we could find it was financially feasible to do those studies, the recommendation was.
Gentlemen, we have about 2 more minutes
Really?
before
Okay.
we need to wrap this up.
So we're 90.
The 90 was, I just got word in my, that we aren't allowed to go 90. So if there's anything that you guys, and before we finish up, I just want to say that there's been a lot of great presentations you guys did. I thought there was definitely going to be more blows, thrown exchange between you two, but that's thank you very much for that. So if there's anything that either of you, that both of you guys would like to say in closing, maybe to reiterate some of your most important points, Ben, we can start with you.
Just a couple quick things. I think one of the things that I think is important to note between, as you can hear the two of us, there's a lot of common ground. I think there's a lot of places that there can be agreement when we have conversations. And I think it's very important, to have communication between the boards and to be able to ensure that the town administrator is involved in the process. And I think the key that I really want to hit home is that I think the Finance Committee plays a critical role, and we have a great Finance Committee in this town that works very hard to do a lot of good things, and it got a little worse when I left, but but anyway, that aside, actually, the person who replaced me I think is fantastic, but probably better than me. So in his first year. But the fact is that that I think it's very important that people understand that communication and process I think are very important, and I think the Governance Committee has put forward a proposal that I think gives clarity and understanding to people to be able to say this is what needs to be done and this is when it needs to be done. And I think the Finance Committee has a role to play, and I think they have gone too far in many respects because of the way things have been done to this point when it comes to the recommendation being what's voted on, and I think it undermines their independence. And I want to see them independent. I want to see them be that voice that can say this is the right thing to do, and not be the voice that's saying this is what we're doing. I think there's a nuance there, just like Dan had mentioned at the beginning, and I think it's important that the Finance Committee has that role, and that the Select Board be able to feel comfortable that their priorities are heard, even if it's not necessarily accepted. And I think sometimes that gets lost. And I just want to say thank you to both of you for this opportunity and this conversation.
Great. Dan?
So thank you very much, Ben. I mean, this has been a great conversation, and John, again, thank you. The role of the Finance Committee is to be the eyes and ears of the taxpayer, and to really keep the taxpayer as our ultimate protector of the taxpayers' dollars. And I think by ensuring that we continue to provide that oversight, we need to be able to provide the budget. We can work on a lot of the other details. I'm all for empowering the town administrator and having the town administrator do far more than has been done necessarily in the past, and sharing the information with the Select Board. It's about who makes that final recommendation to town meeting. And while I certainly don't want the Select Board to feel like we're trying to take away things from them, eventually somebody's got to make a decision. And if you have the Select Board making the decision, the Select Board that controls 30 to 40% of the town budget, but making the decisions for all of the budget, I mean, under the proposal here, the final presentation to town meeting, they could just slash the school's budget if they wanted to. I mean, they don't necessarily, the thing says they don't weigh in on it before it's passed on to the Finance Committee, but ultimately you need a balanced budget. If they could decide that their spending is more important than the schools, they could just make the decisions that the budget that they present to the town meeting is to reduce the school budget. And not to say that that's necessarily going to happen, but I think that if you're having an independent board that oversees all aspects of the budget early on in the process and makes those recommendations has stood Holliston really well. And I don't think that there's any reason to further empower the Select Board to make those decisions for the entire town from a fiscal perspective. Hear them, and I certainly want to make sure that we work together to get your priorities across and funded if possible. But that having the independent, that again, it's sort of like that Ways and Means in the Congress, right? That proposes that budget that then the Congress, which is the town meeting, votes on. The President of the United States can propose a budget, but doesn't get to actually decide that, right? The President, only Congress can decide that. So I think it's very important to maintain the the responsibilities and oversight that the Finance Committee has been a great steward of, through town, for 20, 30, 40 years.
Okay. Well, that's all we have time for tonight. So thank you very much for joining us. And on behalf of Holliston Cable Access TV and Just Thinking, tune in next time, and we'll see everybody again soon.